Thanks for listening to Book and Lounge. Subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube so you don't miss an episode in the future. Welcome to Book and Lounge. I'm your host, Jacqueline. In this episode, we are discussing the seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. It's a powerful and incisive book that examines the long history of European exploitation of Africa. First published in 1972, the book has become a classic in the fields of African studies, development economics, and global politics. But is it still relevant? I'm joined by Katrina, Kay, and Taiwo to explore Rodney's ideas as well as the nuances and complexities involved in understanding Africa's development. So get yourself a drink, get comfortable, and enjoy. Afternoon, and thanks for joining. So had you guys heard of this book before it came onto the reading list?
A classic.
A classic. And had you read it?
Now I have, yeah, but before, no.
Like most of us, you hadn't read it. It was on my list for a very long time. My father has a copy, and I remember picking it up. Yeah, picking it up. Because my father worked in development for a while, and I do remember picking it up and I need to read that, but I just never got around to it. So when Shanti suggested it, I was like, yeah, now is really a good time to do it.
One of Shanti's light reading choices.
Yeah, she does like them, doesn't she? Anyway, so in the book, Walter Rodney describes how countries in the West have exploited African resources to enrich themselves, and then created an insurmountable challenge for African countries to develop. And he starts off by defining development and underdevelopment. And I just wondered whether you agreed with those definitions, and what does development mean and what does underdevelopment mean?
Hey, you can start. You work in development.
That's not fair. I think I broadly agreed. I think he's very specific about framing development in economic terms. It's about the economic development of the country. I like that he talks about social and cultural development. He says there's this false binary in trying to compare the two, and I quite liked that. He says, how do you compare the dance of one country with the dance of another? You know, they're both very cultural specific, but I think what he's talking about through the book is the economic development.
Yeah.
And I felt that was useful in terms of making a comparison, particularly when we think about these countries today and we think about underdevelopment, not just for those of us who work in development, but when you're thinking about political discourse as well, it very much is around economic development and the implications that has for a country. So I think that was a useful place to start.
Also, the fact that he talked about development and how development is a continuum, and how certain societies, if they're left alone without external interference, how he thinks, according to a Marxist approach, they would develop, going through certain stages, which may or may not be accurate, bearing in mind that this was written, over 50 years ago?
Late 60s?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I like that. I like the way he looked at things through a political prism of Marxism, but how he didn't limit everything to, as Kay was saying, economic development, although that's the normal indicator of development, things like GDP and all the rest of it. But he kind of broadened it out.
Yeah.
That was interesting.
I was thinking about just the term development and in relation to nations and countries. And I was just thinking, we use the word development and these are developed countries, but development doesn't really ever stop, does it? Because nations and countries are always developing. We're always evolving and developing into something else. It just made me think that this use of the word developed countries, it's not really describing what really happens, because every country is developing.
Yeah.
Maybe not at the same rate.
I like what you're saying, because I'm sitting here and I couldn't find the way to express myself. But what you're saying is more in line with what I'm thinking, because I felt his development was very tied to economic Marxist approach. And I know I've said it before, but I just feel like it was probably would have read very well in its time. But I think development now, we might think of, okay, economics is very important, but you think of all the other developments that take place in how people view things and I find it dated, his work, as I've said before. Sorry to cut in there, Jackie.
No, I think that's an interesting point, and I think perhaps readers such as ourselves, we would like to look beyond just economic development and look at other factors in a country. But if you look at wider political discourse, actually the truth is a lot of it is tied to economic development today. You think of all the kind of indices that exist, whether a country is doing well or it isn't doing well. If you think of how we break down groups of countries, we still today use language like least developed country, lower middle income country, upper middle income country, and then developed country. So we have this knowledge which allows us to think kind of more broadly about the development continuum of countries. But oftentimes it does come down to what is their GDP, how many people are earning less than $2 a day, those sorts of stats.
Yeah, that's very true. But isn't that how you're sort of jacketing it all in this very Western approach, the capitalist Western approach? And I feel like although he's saying that Europe and the West, underdeveloped Africa, and are taking all its resources, which they still are, he's not going outside of that way of looking at things.
But what other way then you feel that we should be looking at things?
Well, I mean, I'm not. I haven't invented a perfect way.
But you can invent one now.
I feel like as long as African countries are just copying and trying to do the development that the so-called development the West has done, they're only breeding themselves the problems that we're in anyway. If they succeeded in getting there, but they probably are going to get undercut by all sorts of other things first. So if you take like in Cuba, when they started and they tried to frame things differently, which, okay, it's socialism, but not perhaps the Soviet Union version of it. It looked like a different approach.
Felt more communal than even feudalism, didn't it? So although you had the government controlling everything was shared out supposedly shared out within society.
Yes, and there, I mean, I don't know. I've only read articles, and they might be snapshots of small projects that didn't really reflect the country as a whole, because that's often what happens, isn't it? But it felt like different ways of trying to do things. What you're saying, Kay, because everything is controlled, isn't it, by the World Bank and all these sort of financial things. But I feel like if Walter Rodney wants to tell us how it has all been set up by the West, but at the same time he's sort of taking that same framework.
But do you think it was the same framework, but from a different perspective, though? Because the approach is still pretty much a Marxist approach.
Yes, exactly.
So he's looking at the predominant.
He's looking at it through the eyes of a socialist perspective. But I don't know. I just would like to see something, and maybe it would come. I feel like he might have developed it over time.
But he was a socialist, so I think it only makes sense that he would be looking at it from a socialist perspective.
Nyerere was the socialist, but his way of trying to develop the country, I feel like it was an African socialism.
So you think you should have approached it in a much more radical way?
I don't know, really. I mean, it's easy to criticise, isn't it? I'm not sure what he should have done. I just sort of feel like every time he was talking about African societies, and he was almost sort of in his historic area part, I feel like he was sort of ranking them, but looking at it through almost a Western perspective. That was my view of it anyway. Maybe
I think he was just using the tools available to him and what was already established in describing the societies that existed within various regions within Africa at the time. So he talked about Marxist three stages of development, which were communalism, feudalism, and then capitalism. And then he just used that framework to describe what stages various African countries were in. And I think he was just, because he's a socialist, he was just using the socialist model.
Yes, I get that. But I feel like in places like, you know how in the British colonialism, when they were starting, they thought of the Zulu nations and the Ndebele people as somehow better than some of the other people because they were more warlike and they could fight better. And, you know, you sort of think, well, that's one way of looking at society. It can make you powerful, but is this development? And I feel like he just follows that same thing. He speaks of the Zulu nation as, you know, he seems to see it as something progressive.
I'm really not sure I agree. I'm not sure I agree with that at all. I just feel that he was describing what was there and what the formation of the societies at the time. The only thing that he's doing, which I guess you could challenge, is that he's seeing it from a Marxist point of view. But I think essentially what he's doing, he's saying this is what was there. I didn't feel that he was basically saying one was better than the other or one was more developed than the other. I didn't feel that he was saying that at all.
Well, I'm not sure if he was saying they were better, but in terms of his scale, the Marxist framework that he's using, it seemed to me that he was ranking different societies.
Did Taiwo and Kay, did you feel that he was ranking?
Ranking.
I don't think he was ranking. I agree with what you said, that he needed a framework, because what he's basically saying is how the development or the economic progress in these countries has come at the expense of economic development in these countries. So I think what he provided was this criteria in saying, well, they could build their wealth off what was extracted from these countries, but the countries from whom those goods were extracted then weren't able to use those goods to develop in the same way because they didn't have them. It was the absence of them. Do you think there's this point that this book is of its time? And I suppose now with so much of the literature that's around, you know, Black and British, and I've said that, but I can't think of any more names. But, you know, this whole post-George Floyd, you're going to a bookshop now and everything's Black this, Black that. Yeah. And you think, great. And it's almost we've got so much of this literature at our disposal. At the time this was published, this would have been radical for somebody to put forward this argument that, well, yes, these countries are undeveloped and it's a direct result of the actions of these interests. I think that would have been radical. And
yes,
maybe he felt he needed to use that particular framework of how economic development was discussed then to explain the underdevelopment, if you see what I mean. So he was forced not to talk about it in the most radical terms, but to use the criteria that was set.
That's what I say all the time. It's a book of its time. I think it's a very important book. I had heard of it before. I hadn't read it, but I do think it's of its time.
The second chapter of the book, he describes African societies before contact with Europe. And he describes the various regions and the level of, in quotation marks, development in those regions. And from what I took from this, that various areas were at different levels. So, for example, East Africa was very different to West Africa. The one thing that really surprised me from reading this is when he was describing the society in Rwanda, where you had the Tutsis at the top and they controlled the land, and then the Hutus worked for them. Now, I have always thought that was introduced by the Belgians. I didn't actually know that was there before the Belgians arrived, and then the Belgians took advantage of it. Sorry?
Is his historic analysis of that correct?
I'm much more likely to believe him than the Belgians.
Yes, but he's using a number of sources that are from that time, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that, I don't know. I just feel like I wasn't totally convinced of that, because
Why?
I've also read things like maybe you have, that it wasn't as cut and dried as that, and that when the colonials arrived, they liked the idea of that separation, and maybe there was some degree of what he said, but that it was exacerbated because of the sort of divide and rule and the idea that these people looked more, I don't know, Caucasian, or they might have been.
He didn't say that it was because of what they looked like, that's why the society was divided in that way. It was more that some groups of people are pastoralists, others are agriculturalists.
Yes.
And it just so happened that the Tutsis were the ones that kept the cattle.
Yes.
And then the Hutus are the ones that were agriculturists. And so the Tutsis just controlled the land, and then the Hutus worked for them. I'm not sure that it was based on what they looked like.
No, I'm sure you're right. That was brought in a bit later. But did the Tutsis actually control and the Hutus worked for them? I don't know. I just don't entirely trust because I think everything more's known, more research has been done.
But that's not the only society that he describes where there was a group of ruling people who then controlled other people, is it?
Yeah, he spoke about Japan.
Sorry?
He spoke about Japan as well, didn't he?
China.
The feudal system in Japan back in the day, that kind of thing. Although when you look at the guide to further reading, chapter 2, he does talk about studies on early African history are lacking for many reasons. And then he goes on and says, there's a dearth of reliable information, and some of the information that he's using is by, as he says it, non-Africans. He's looking for someone that, if they're non-African, they're providing history from a sympathetic perspective.
And I think that's a really important point to note, because the dearth of history, the dearth of written history on the region, on the continent, I think this is why this is such an important book. Even if we question some aspects of it, he's adding to the canon. Here is somebody writing about the continent and attempting to capture the history. And I think what my reading of chapter 2, for me, that was an education. I was learning things for the first time. So that's why I found it quite interesting. What I took away from that, and I think the broader point maybe he was trying to make, is, look, there were people here before. There's a history here that has never been talked about. To me, that was the strong point. And it made me think of Things Fall Apart, kind of the final chapter. And what you have is this whole book which talks about this very intricate society with all their rituals and their history, their traditions. And then it's just summed up by the British guy of, I'll write a book, I'll put it in a paragraph, primitive histories of these. Nobody was capturing this, nobody was trying to understand it. So I think the point he was making in telling these stories, there was a rich culture, there were societies there. They have a history that doesn't just start with the colonialists.
Yes, but I do feel like a whole lot of research on family histories, archaeology, looking at things that have been written in Arabic that weren't really, I doubt they were available for him to read about in his day, because it's more recent research and there is a lot going on. And that's why I said it would be lovely to see it all, his history chapter reviewed, and what's the word when they bring things up to
updated. But why? You see, this is what I don't understand. Why he's writing this book at the time with the information that he had at the time? Why is it that we need to challenge him?
Because it's fine to read it as a groundbreaking work at its time, that's maybe saying things that weren't, I presume saying things that weren't being said at that time, and bringing in this history, what Kay said, of, people were here doing important stuff before anyone from Europe, but not all of it is accurate anymore. So you read it for what it was in its day. You wouldn't use it as your source book for African history, particularly now. You
could still use it, though, because if you're using it as a foundation, if you're using it as a springboard
Yes.
To consider, where things have come from, such that we've arrived at where we are today. Because, for example, in Nigeria, the whole Unilever thing, which I found interesting, I've always wondered why Unilever, why they're so big, why they had such a head start. He gives you that kind of insight because he provides a perspective about the fact that, if both your legs are tied together and you're told to start a race, but the person is given 100 yards head start after tying your legs together, you're never going to catch up with that person. And you can never really make a significant dent in the dominance that Unilever has in places in West Africa and the continent as a whole because of the historical massive advantage they have for the reasons he explains. It's more than just a company. It's much more than that. It's kind of like embedded in society. And these are part of the reasons why. And you could apply the Unilever example to other things, in nations. This is why you can never really catch up. If you want to develop in the same way that the West has developed, unless you're going to use a different model of development, then you will never really catch up with them because they're not going to slow down and they're not going to give you anything to help you develop. The head start they have is so enormous that it's impossible to catch up.
And I think this book is actually still very relevant today. It explains to you why African nations are still where they are in terms of development. It explains to you how the education system was never set up to enrich.
Yes. All that post-colonial thing, I'm not arguing about that. I'm arguing about his pre-colonial history. I am quite interested to read what you have been reading to actually make you question. I'll have to go through it and write some notes for you.
I'm very interested in that. But anyhow, so the one thing that we're talking about is his contrast of East and West African development. The other thing that I found fascinating is that, and you don't read this in many history books, the fact that when the Europeans arrived, they were quite surprised because the nations were producing things like iron. They were making a lot out of iron, out of leather. Some regions were producing cloth, regions like the Congo. And then I can't remember if it was Benin or Dahomey, where the Dutch compared the streets there to the streets in Harlem. And they actually said that they were much more organized. So for me, I felt like I learned a lot. And it is not often that you read about how these nations and these societies had actually developed. Because what you tend to find is history books telling you how the Europeans came and then discovered this lake, discovered that mountain, and then they introduced civilization into Africa.
I think the point, what you were saying, Jacqueline, it's interesting to learn that there was industry, that there were skilled craftsmen there before. I think it links into the kind of the other wider point that Rodney is making in his book, is that this idea of, the backward savage, the native who doesn't know any better, that actually comes after.
Yeah.
That isn't the start. That's used, that argument, that narrative is used to justify their subjugation of these people. They don't arrive there thinking these are really backward people. What they find is these industries, these skills. They then start to extract, and some people, in terms of goods, gold, etc., and in many cases people. But they then need a narrative to justify why they're doing these terrible things. So that the racism comes after. I think it's all part of. He tells that story very well. It's all very logical. It's all very horrible, but actually it was logical. It was business.
Because there is that rationale, isn't there, about it? Because I like the way he explained. I can't remember exactly how he said it, but he was talking about commerce, industry, and economic activity being appropriate to the needs of the society. So you've got different societies in Africa trading with each other according to the needs of what the people want.
Yeah.
So things like alcohol, for example, hard liquor, they were not trading in that because they were not producing that. But things like fine leather works and, like the bronzes, the Ife bronzes, that kind of thing. And even gold as well. When you think about gold also had not just a monetary significance, but it also had a spiritual symbolism for many of these societies. So the ways in which they're trading is not purely commerce, as in, the bottom line and we want to make money. There are other cultural signifiers going into the trade as well. So the trade is going on and developing according to the needs of the societies and the things that people put value on. The things that people in these African societies put value on isn't necessarily the same thing that the Europeans at that stage of the European society's development are valuing. So now when you find these trading nations from this little island called the United Kingdom needing to expand their markets because they have a particular way of looking at the world and thinking about, this nation of shopkeepers, we have to broaden the market, we have to go overseas, we have to find other places. They not only trade as in will exchange, but they're also looking for markets where the things that we don't want, we now want to dump. And I've always found that very interesting, that two-pronged approach. You've got the above the belt stuff that's going on, you've got the below the belt stuff going on. In the same way with the development, isn't it? It's like we extract these resources to the extent that we extract human beings in the whole enslavement project. But at the same time, we put in place these particular policies and trade provisions that actually prevent the people that we're draining all these resources from even developing themselves. So it's that two-pronged approach, which I find really fascinating. He's explaining it. He's breaking it down. It's not just we're taking, it's we're taking and what is left. We're even preventing you from using properly what is left.
So would you say that then that was a deliberate policy or strategy adopted by these Western nations? They set out to extract, but also to undermine and stop the development of African countries.
Yes.
At a certain point, I think it became policy. I think it might have started a bit more haphazardly, but at a certain point it became I don't think a very spoken policy, but under the radar sort of policy.
Because it's deliberate, isn't it? Because when you think about the World Trade Organization and unfair trade laws and all the rest of it, you think about the whole monetary system, the global monetary system, and the way it's weighted against African nations, Asian nations, Latin American nations. So not only do you have to go there cap in hand to get a loan, but at the same time, the rate at which you are then asked to repay the loan and the conditions under which you have to be able to qualify for the loan, they all disadvantage you from developing your own industries. It's all about making sure it's that capitalist model of not only do we take the resources that we need, but we prevent you from developing yourself.
He gives examples, doesn't he, of leaders of their societies who wanted more manufacturing and so on, before colonialism properly was established, and how they were sort of blocked every time. And that's it's just continued, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think the Ashanti who were continually asking for weapons, and they were asking for machinery and industrial equipment so that they could develop the items within their own nations. But every time I think they even send dignitaries to come and negotiate, but never the Europeans or the British were never willing to give them that information and to give them the technology so that they could develop their own nations.
Yeah, there's a really good quote which I kind of copied down because I thought it summarised much of what we've discussed. And he writes that British trade, and I think Rodney was actually quoting somebody else, but the quote is, British trade is a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and naval power and an African foundation. And I thought that encapsulated very well that the idea of this tiered system. You have your place here, this is what we need from you, and nothing else. And the next layer, I think he's then talking about the Americas and the role that starts to play in British trade and wealth building. But on top of it is the British Empire. And I agree with what you were saying, Katrina. I did get the sense it was haphazard, but as the benefits start to be realised, then it becomes a very explicit policy. Exactly. And I think we see that in later chapters as well, when they're talking about things, for example, the role of education and how that was used or withheld.
Yeah.
And I suppose, I know we focused on the British, but I I think what I liked about it is he talks about the role of the French and other empires as well. And I think is it Cote d'Ivoire he's talking about? How there was a demand.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, there's a demand for education. People want to go and learn, but, for the time being, we don't need you to learn. We don't need you to be able to read.
Mm-hmm.
And education only becomes accessible when it becomes useful for the economic system or useful for economic output. We need you to have some skills so you can work in these trades. So
and run the system effectively for us.
Yeah.
For our benefit, yeah.
Which is where he's firmly wearing his Marxism hat, isn't he? His Marxist.
Yeah.
Looking at the capitalist system and say the capitalist system is only there for itself. It wants to propagate itself, and anything that would form a competitor to its thriving is kept, thwarted and kept constrained and contained.
Mm-hmm. So just to come back then to the term development, and by this I mean economic development. So then, for economic development to happen, does it require an exploitation of one country of another?
You mean in forever, for all time? That's the rules, or
wondering, because if Europe and the West have developed because they've managed to exploit and extract wealth from all these other nations, and then also now we have China, who extracting minerals and so on from Africa for their own development. I'm just wondering, and we can argue whether or not China is exploiting. I think they are. So the terms that they're negotiating is not to the benefit of Africans. So then is there an exploitation of one nation of another always required for?
It's an interesting question to think about. And I think before I kind of answer that, I want to go back and say another thing I think Rodney does well in this book is that I do think there is a balance in that he talks about the role that Africans played in this system. Yeah. It's an uncomfortable truth, but this system wouldn't have been sustained for as long as it was sustained without the Africans taking part. And that point about do you need extractive, do you need exploitation? Well, definitely the economic development that the West was pursuing at that time, they needed raw materials.
Yeah.
And they didn't have that in abundance, and Africa did. And the easiest way for them to do it was to subjugate the people, get those resources, and then they could power their development back home. But when you think about it today, and I think it's interesting you mentioned Asia and interesting you mentioned China. Yeah, maybe you do see some of the similar patterns going on of these one big powerful country coming in and extracting. But there are people who are complicit in that extraction. You would have thought people are savvy enough to think about, well, how can we sell these raw materials to another country that really needs them, but do it in a way that benefits? How can we set up our tax systems or our education systems in a way that we're not being left behind?
But then are they not negotiating, and I absolutely appreciate that, probably making excuses for them here. Are they not negotiating from a position, the Chinas and the Europeans, are they not negotiating from a position of power in that they have the resources and they make the terms rather than these small African countries who come begging and who need the Chinese to come and build the roads for them because they simply don't have although they have the minerals, they don't have anywhere to process them and then make manufactured materials from them. So they need to send them outside for them to be processed.
Yeah, I think I struggle with this one. Yes, there definitely is a power imbalance. There is one side of the equation who are very powerful, China's the West, etc. But do I think there is more that could be done on the other side? Yes. It may be that the Chinas, I know we keep saying China, but other countries are so powerful that these nations they're not equipped. They can't match that. But I think you hear, some of the stories, the news, rent seeking that we hear about. Could more be done? Is there not some way to try to structure these contracts in a way that more money is being paid back, or something's being left behind, so it's not a complete we're just taking out and there's nothing there for the wider community? Tax receipts and something to support the development on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough one. This is why I think this book is relevant, because it foreshadowed some of these questions that and these discussions that we're still having today.
I agree. Absolutely.
So the question you ask, is at the same time, is it a case of, yes, there will always be exploitation of one nation or group of people compared to another when you want to have this rapid economic development? If you're taking economic development at maybe a much slower pace, maybe you don't need to extract in that exploitative way. Maybe there's more of a balance between trading partners. If you're saying, okay, we'll grow at a leisurely rate rather than this kind of steep, almost unlimited rate at which we grow.
But then the majority of countries have adopted the Western system of development. So I struggle to see, you have the Cubas who took a different path, but there are very few countries that will sit and analyze and say, actually, we're not going to adopt capitalism as a model for development. So that
Bhutan.
Sorry?
Bhutan.
Well, I said there are few.
Okay.
There are very few who choose a different system. Most countries just see where the West is, and that's where they want to go. And so they would adopt exactly the same systems and the same processes that the West has in place in terms of development and developing their countries. So it takes, I'll come back to my benevolent dictator who has a strategy and a plan and knows what they're doing and where they want to see their country going. For that to be able to happen, I can't see, especially when you have the West ramming democracy down your throat, I can't see any leader taking a different route to development. And so that means we're just going to be perpetuating the same mistakes that leaders have been making since independence.
Leaders in Africa, do you mean?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, because like Taiwo mentioned, it mentioned Asia, and I think definitely where this book dates itself is that when this was written, I don't think he extensively focuses on Asia, but he definitely makes some comparisons and the impact of colonialism on these nations, not just Africa, but Asian nations as well. But today, economic growth in Asia has exploded. You've got the Asian tigers, they lifted themselves, lifted many people in that continent out of poverty through, some might say, what you call for, Jacqueline, kind of the benevolent dictator. There are definitely examples of countries that were led by a strong man who put in place had a very single view on how the country was going to grow, and it did grow. I think maybe what those countries had that Africa never benefited from was the space to move forward in those ways. And I think this is something Rodney talks about later in the book, about the continued engagement of certain powers in Africa and how that's all supported, but that's all fed into underdevelopment as well. Yeah. And I think that's a very timely conversation because we've just seen what's happened in Niger in recent days, and the protests against France, which, okay, I think there are many commentators who are saying it's perhaps is a little bit disingenuous on some parts, and some people calling for Russia, but are they being played? Or Russia's influence isn't kosher. They're not honest brokers. But there definitely is an argument to say, well, what about France's continued engagement in West Africa after independence? My, they are mightily close to the presidents in that region and continue to demand resources from the region. If you're thinking about nuclear, this is where to me, the book is of greatest importance, that you can read some of these arguments and think, bloody hell, 50 years later, this is too relevant for a book this old.
To those,
just very quickly, just another example I thought of about extractives. I saw on the news recently, there was a piece about the number of nurses traveling from Uganda to work in the NHS. Mm-hmm. It's actually mind-boggling. So the president there has said, well, we haven't got jobs for all these people. So if you're a nurse in Uganda, you're working in a rural area, you've got a family you want to, an extended family to support, you're rationally going to say, well, of course I want to go and work in the NHS because I'm going to earn good money. But from the point of view of the UK, is it morally right that we have these developing countries, in inverted commas, who are training their community to deliver a service, and the NHS just comes in and go, thank you very much, we'll have you because we've got an aging population and we need them, and there is nobody being left behind. So extraction is evolving. It might not be the raw materials anymore, but we're still taking.
It may not be enslaved people, but it's another form of extraction of people, though, isn't it?
It is.
Willingly, because the whole system is tilted in favour of the global north. I thought there was some kind of, NHS had put some kind of moratorium on taking nurses from the Philippines, from East African countries, West African countries, etc.
All of that has changed with this. This government just doesn't give a toss.
But also there's agreements about not advertising for nurses in some countries, but that doesn't stop the nurses in those countries applying for a job if they see an advert. So like I think for Ghana, there's an agreement that the UK don't actively recruit. But if somebody in Ghana sees a job and applies, it's a free world, isn't it? They can come.
But Katrina, you say that. There are agencies actively
of course,
recruiting.
Yes, whether or not there's active recruitment, if people have freedom of movement to apply for a job and they're being drawn to where it appears to be richer and more favourable to bring your family or to bring yourself and send money back to your family, people will do that, won't they?
But do you think then that these countries who are taking, so for example, UK taking all these doctors that have been trained in Nigeria, should be compensating Nigeria for all that training?
Yeah, why not? But to do that, wouldn't Nigeria have to put some sort of restrictions on their doctors going away? And how would they do that?
I think they were talking about not being able to give you your practicing certificate until you've served a certain number of years in the Nigerian medical system.
Yeah.
Whereas Kenya, on the other hand, is just telling all its citizens, just go and find jobs outside.
And send the money home. Well, countries like the Philippines have embraced that, haven't they? That they depend upon remittance. They train people. They go off to Saudi Arabia and UK and wherever else, America, I suppose. But the country gets significant remittance from those individuals, and it's part of the way their economy works, I understand.
But I don't think that in itself works.
No, remittances are not the solution.
No, they're not the solution, but they are one way that people maneuver in the system. Do you get what I mean? I'm not advocating it in any way. I'm just saying it's one of the things that happens. Zimbabwe is another.
I get it, and I get that remittances play a huge role in many countries' GDP. But I don't think that's what really, as nations, we should be advocating. We shouldn't be sending our nurses that we've trained, spent a whole lot of money, lots of money to train, to then go away and work elsewhere. I was involved in a conversation yesterday where I learned that cervical cancer is the most prevalent cancer in Uganda. Now, if you think only half of the population is women, but cervical cancer actually is the biggest killer of women. And the guy that I was speaking to is a doctor who says that they struggle to find trained healthcare workers to go and advocate, raise awareness, and administer tests and screening. And that's because all these people are being trained. And where are they going? They're coming to work here.
Yeah, in the global north.
So it's a huge imbalance.
Yes, the brain drain, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because when you think about it, that whole brain drain thing was from the 70s? And yet still, even now, it's going on in some ways.
It goes further back than the 70s, I think.
Does it? Even before then?
Because I'm probably at least as old as you. I think I might be older. I can't remember a time when you didn't go to a hospital and notice how many doctors and nurses there were who, in my eyes, as a 6-7-year-old, were people who come from somewhere else. And I think most of them probably had. I don't know if that was all of them. But it was always like that. It's relied on people. And even if you didn't rely on doctors coming from India, Pakistan, Africa, then all the nurses were Irish, weren't they? If they weren't from the Caribbean. It's been like it my lifetime anyway. So it's a big thing. You know, they talk about it now as if it was something new. It's not new. It requires a big restructuring of the NHS, I think, to avoid it, really. Because it's relied on this for so many decades.
Yeah, definitely. Of course, it's just kind of prompted me the Windrush, like post Second World War, come and support, the call to come and support the mother country. Yeah. So you had a lot of people of fit working age from the Caribbean coming to work in the transport sector and in the NHS. Mm-hmm. And I think Taiwo talked about this brain drain. That still continues. Of course, not on the scale that you see on the continent of Africa, because the numbers there, obviously, the Caribbean islands have much smaller populations. But when I speak to family members back there, those that can, at the moment, pass those school exams, you're off to America.
Yeah.
You have to go to college in America, and if you're lucky enough to get a job, you stay there and you might send money back. But there aren't the opportunities there. But for the people who stay behind, healthcare is really expensive because there aren't many doctors, and those that are practicing, obviously there's money to be made in private healthcare because there's such a demand for your services. That we can still point to like these examples today. I feel like if Rodney was still alive, and we know he was assassinated, perhaps this is the updating that Katrina was talking about. These are the examples that he might rely on to talk about the continuum of this, if not underdevelopment, but this kind of, I'm trying to think of a word, but I can't, but this.
I think it's underdevelopment.
You think it's underdevelopment? I was going to say plateauing of development.
No, I still think it's underdevelopment.
Deliberate policies that lead to, or deliberate policies that prevent, isn't it? That prevent development.
Mm.
Yeah, because there's so many challenges. If it's not the extraction of minerals at the moment, it's also the extraction of human capital. And then on top of that, you have unfair trade practices. You have the organizations like the IMF who will lend you money, but will lend you money at higher interest rates. And then you have the Western nations support leaders who favor their policies or who do their bidding for them. So it's just a continuation. It's just never really ending. Someone was commenting about how the French are leaving Niger for the second time. And I was like, but did the French actually really leave in the first place?
They didn't, and they're not leaving now. They've still got, I read today, 1,500 soldiers in some, and they've got air power there as well.
Mm. They've got, they've got a lot of interest there. I think around uranium.
Uranium.
It's about uranium.
Okay. Yeah, they're still protecting, and I was listening to another podcast. Just they were discussing what's going on in Niger, and the French have in so many words have said, you don't touch our interests.
Yeah.
You leave them alone, or that will force us to engage.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was the Italian Prime Minister who she made this speech that kind of did the rounds when she talked about, you have the CFA franc, and it's backed by French
by euros nowadays.
Yeah, euros, or their bank is still involved.
Yes.
I'm obviously not explaining this very well. There's lots of details out there, but the engagement still runs deep. So yeah, I think
all these former French colonies still have their foreign reserve in France.
Okay,
and I know if they want to make any economic policies, they basically have to be agreed by France.
Mm-hmm.
Before they basically can't make any independent decisions on monetary policy.
Wow.
And so the French basically have never really left.
They haven't left at all. The Guardian I saw had an article today saying that kind of this coup and the recent coups in Chad and
Mali.
I think Mali are actually now the beginning of the crumbling of the French colonial system. Whether that's, that it's only really now that the French colonies are emancipating themselves, I suppose, from the French.
But they're not going out lying down. I tell you, they're fighting for their interests, because I've read certain places where they're threatening to invade. But also, what I found interesting is ECOWAS's response, saying
Which
that
was what?
basically they're saying that if they don't reinstate the former president, they're going to attack Niger. In fact, Taiwo, it was your president who was leading the call for attacking for attacking Niger. And I just think to myself, but hold on, shouldn't you all be on the same side? Surely you want to get rid of the colonizers and create your own path.
It's this. Maybe it's more complex than just getting rid of the colonizers.
I absolutely get it, because if you think about it, all these leaders are also quite old. So they possibly are also afraid that, what's happened in Niger could happen to them.
Yeah.
There is that. And then there's the second thing where they benefit from Western protection. And so the Western puppet masters are possibly pulling their strings, saying, actually, you have to come out strongly against, the coup leaders in Niger.
It's going back to what you were saying, though, about the downside of democracy, isn't it? Because the deposed guy in Niger was democratically elected.
Allegedly.
Well, exactly.
But there is something about
they're talking about reinstating him and why they're supposedly supporting him. But yeah, it's all smoke and mirrors, really, isn't it? These things.
Your point about development and planned development, and do you need this strongman who come in and has a plan? I suppose something that's notable about that region, the Sahel region, is they have very young populations. Because I read somewhere that nearly 50% of Niger's population is under the age of 20.
Wow.
This is a really young country being led by lots of old men. And young country, old men and women also, but I think predominantly men. So are they being served? Do they see a path? We're talking about what development, how has Rodney framed development, what development's important to people. Do those young people see a future for themselves? Do they have access to education opportunities? Is there a job for them at the end of when they've completed school?
Yeah.
Will they be able? What's their equivalent of the white picket? The 2 up, 2 down with a white picket fence and a car in the garage. Do they have those opportunities? Can they see them? They can't. So I think there's all these layers of things that are feeding into this discontent. But yeah, it's interesting to hear you say you think it's still underdevelopment rather than plateauing. And
no, I can't see that many African nations have moved on that much from where they were when they gained their independence. And there's a lot of factors at play that you make it underdevelopment rather than some level of plateauing. Yeah. And so the book focuses a lot on knowledge and education. And so how did the colonial system then shape the African mindset? And what was the significance of knowledge production in African development and also in the development of the independence movement?
Well, I think he makes the point that in some ways it came back to bite them. There was always the fear if you don't educate the people, otherwise then they'll know how to articulate their demands. And I think he talks about how some people, not just in Africa but in the Caribbean, who benefited from those education systems. Yeah. And that's a discussion in itself whether what they learned was truly useful. But then they then returned home and they led the fight for independence. And the trade union movement, for example. So there were some benefits in those ways if we're looking at it from the perspective of the countries that were colonized.
But the education was never really meant for that purpose, was it? The education was meant to serve the colonial masters. Yes. They only taught them a certain amount, and they only taught a certain number of people. So in places like Kenya, for example, I think they refused to educate the Kikuyu. And so the Kenyans just set up their own education systems. And in some other countries, there was a lot of, I think it was the French-speaking countries, there was a lot of demand for more schools. So the education was really never meant to give African people any knowledge and develop them in any way. It was just so that they could help the colonial masters continue the same system.
But I guess he would say that it was a similar situation back in the global north, wasn't it? Education for the masses wasn't something that was given freely. It was something that only when it was necessary that it came about, because you needed a certain level of education for people to do jobs in factories rather than maybe craft things that you're doing in your homes or work the land. So necessity, again, isn't it? The mother of invention. It's always necessity that drives these particular changes. But whose need is being met? That's the issue. But the problem, I guess, with education is that once the genie's out the bottle, you can't put it back. When people are educated, you can't really control how they would then think and what they would then do.
I guess it depends on the education, the education that you give them, because there's so many people that consider themselves educated, but really, when you do think about it, are they really educated? Being absolutely controversial here. It's so well and good having book knowledge, but if you can't apply it, and also if you can't analyze situations within you find it yourself, book knowledge is useless.
I feel like that's the discussion we're having today as well. Like Taiwo said, not just. It was very. I think the differences were very stark. The examples Rodney talks about in Africa, and I think there was a really good example of somebody talking about learning about roses and flowers of England, but having no knowledge of local plants and flowers.
Yeah,
and it wasn't rooted in the local context. It was all about, this is the standard of education. It's an interesting conversation, and are we learning the right skills? Are we being taught the right things? Even today, I know we're talking specifically about an African context, but you think about the discussions we have today about education. Are we educating our young for the industries of the future or the industries of the past?
Yeah.
Are they learning digital skills? Are they learning about data management? This is where the demand is today, but that's not where a lot of the education is focused. And how can we help people adapt? But again, I think how Rodney talks about it, you think of education as a good thing. You should learn, expand your mind, learn things. But here he talks about it as a tool. It was a tool to control. And it's quite sinister, actually. I know we talk about it, and it's one of those things you might reflect upon, your own stories you've heard, or your own personal example, but it's more effective than the gun, right, in controlling people.
It is, yeah. And actually, you say that. The president of Uganda says because education system in Uganda is dire, right?
Okay.
But you know what he says? And uneducated people is easier to control.
Which is probably
true. He's now going around telling people to have as many children as they can, right? And all these people are having as many kids as they can. They can't afford to send them to school. And so obviously they're going to grow up uneducated, unable to challenge the status quo.
Which is crazy, because, he's obviously thinking as if to say he's going to live forever.
But all these leaders tend to think that they will, don't they?
How long has he been there, Jackie? When you talk about your strong leader who's going to have their development plan, I was thinking of Museveni. How long has he been in power now?
Museveni has no plan. The only plan he has is to
you're wrong.
Himself.
His plan is to remain the leader.
Yeah.
He's got Boris Johnson's plan, but he's managed to stay. And
He's been there over 38 years?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Almost 40 years he's been there.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I sometimes understand when people challenge my idea of the benevolent dictator. When he came, he had all these ideas about, how countries should be led and how, democracy should be imposed and how you could improve the lives of the people. And so he had all these ideas, but as they say, power corrupts. And so when he became leader, automatically he began getting the riches and the money and becoming powerful. And all of a sudden he did not want to relinquish power, and he didn't really have any motives to put in place all those things that he was talking about at the beginning. And so, yeah, you need to choose your well, you can't really choose your dictator. You need to be lucky with your dictator.
And yeah, we talk about it sometimes quite flippantly, but why? Like, how much more money do you need? Like, what more do you need to buy?
Yeah.
What is it? Is it the moment I'm not in charge, I'm exposed, and the people I've done wrong to will come back and hurt me? What is the thinking behind that? Only I can do what I can do, and
ego.
Yeah, it's that, but it's got to be. It's a hell of an ego trip, right?
It has to be more than ego. I mean, I can't. But also, so we talk about the strong leader, but also it's the people that surround them as well.
Yeah.
It's not just the person. The person, for all we know, may want to leave, but actually, if they're surrounded by all these other people who are benefiting, he may not have that incentive to leave, because then they're whispering all sorts of things in their ears.
Do you believe people are whispering in Museveni's on his own? But the concern then comes, we all have to, death comes to us all at some point. It's what happens when his time is up.
Well, he's at the moment he's grooming his son, but everyone knows his son is an absolute idiot. So
really?
I don't think he's going to last if he takes over.
Which is always the case, isn't it? That succession planning is always a problem for these kind of benevolent dictators, the strong man.
Yeah.
Always a problem.
But idiots are also useful for, the powers behind the throne.
True.
Easy to control, the useful fool.
Easy to manipulate. Yeah.
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 But again, I think linking back to what Rodney talks about, I think this is what he says, and your point earlier, Jacqueline, about the West still engaging and controlling or having some influence on the leaders that are there.
Because many of the leaders would have been educated in the West, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Yes.
And they have all the top brass in the military. All of them are sent to Sandhurst.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those old colonial links they're maintained firmly.
Yeah.
And still today, it never ceases to amaze me. You hear these leaders, who are in charge of these countries and budgets and education systems and talking about, our independence, our freedom. They all send their kids to school in the US and America.
Or when they need medical treatment, where do they go?
Global
West.
North.
Yeah. Are their bank accounts? Where are their bank accounts? Global North. So
elites, in other words, you have, I don't know if it's capitalism, but it's some version of capitalism, isn't it? Where some people have got their hands on the resources and everyone else has to manage best they can. I mean, it's like the aid budgets, isn't it? You were talking about like Sandhurst and all this, but the aid budgets, I don't know if they get any further than the government where does this aid go to? You know how they talk about cutting it. But from what I can see, the fear isn't that some girl child somewhere won't get to learn to read. The fear is that they're going to lose the influence with the government of the country. So I'm not sure where that money goes to. I suppose
it's best place to tell us this.
Sorry? Well, that's an interesting discussion and question about what is it that really matters. I think a lot of, particularly this government, a lot of the criticism is that aid is perhaps being used as an influencing tool rather than as a.
It's for.
No, well, I would. I don't think you're. I think if you speak to a lot of the people who, we had the Department for International Development that was launched in 1997 and was merged with the Foreign Office in 2020. The idea of the Department for International Development, and you listen to acolytes like Claire Short, was about separating aid from from political decisions. And in defense of a lot of people who went to work for DFID, they were true believers in we we invest aid for the sake of trying to reduce poverty.
I'm sure
I think there was perhaps some naivety on their part, but there very much was. There are definitely a group of people who aid is about, these decisions should be made purely on the basis of where need is, not on political decisions. But I think that's naive, because if you look at the countries we invest in, we often invest most in the countries where we have a colonial history.
Of course.
It's no surprise that a lot of our investment is in places like Kenya and Nigeria and other Anglophone African countries, and not Francophone African countries, but there is an attempt to change that. But yeah, and I've said this before, there are, I've worked in aid for a number of years. There are some uncomfortable truths about the industry and how it works. And your first point around it's about influence, I will speak to people who very much see it as an influencing tool. And
I was talking to somebody who has audited Save the Children in Sierra Leone. This is my friends who were staying with me. Their accountants. And I mean, she was just saying to me about how she's seen their accounts. All the money that goes on the so-called expat development workers, and how much more they get paid, and how they drive their air-conditioned cars around, and how they live in whatever expensive accommodation. She's saying, so much of the money is directly and indirectly just going back to the West. She wasn't at all disappointed if they cut the aid budget. She thinks it'd be a very good thing.
But I think, I don't want to be here as like a champion for aid, because I do recognise everything you're saying. I think these are the kind of the uncomfortable questions that we need to ask. But in terms of cutting the aid budget, I don't think it's being cut because people want to see what money is spent being used better. A lot of the cuts that have come about at the moment are directly related to this government diverting the aid budget for
immigrant paying for
in the UK. So I think above 25% of the aid budget hasn't even been spent overseas. It's been spent here in this country predominantly by the Home Office to house people. And there are some people who would say, well, an economy like the UK shouldn't be diverting money for what is supposed to be for vulnerable communities overseas to pay for cost in the UK. Surely those things they could manage, but
I don't agree with that, except that I just feel that if the resources that are being taken out of so many of these countries were actually paid for in proper terms that went back into the countries, there'd been only for an aid budget, because they would have so much money coming in. If you compare it to the oil-rich Arab countries, they were quite underdeveloped countries before their oil came to be found. They've managed to control that, and they're in control of it all. There's no need for them to have aid to help them educate everybody, is it?
And they're also led by strong dictators.
Well,
with a plan.
They are.
But where do they get a lot of their domestic workforce from? It certainly is not their own countries. They are.
It's because they have enough wealth that their citizens don't have to work, right? They can afford to import domestic workers from elsewhere.
You asked about the exploit. Does their development come at the at the cost of the exploitation of others?
Absolutely,
yeah. Okay, they've been able to develop, they've got oil, but the conversations, for example, we're having around Qatar World Cup, who was building those stadiums?
But those same people, I think there's a lot of finger pointing at Qatar when you think that those people are probably living in as good accommodation and taking the same risks as if they were building in Mumbai. And I think there's an awful lot of hypocrisy at the pointing of fingers and the people in Qatar. But the thing about the governments like the Saudis, like the Qataris, they have a small population of their own citizens, and they have made sure they share the wealth amongst them. That's why the strong man is
the strong man.
Everyone's happy with the strong man because he is sharing it out.
I think the discussions around Qatar were, I don't know how much of that I agree with. I think there were specific concerns around the importing of foreign labour for a sporting event. I think there was a specific event and how that was being financed and developed. I think that's where a lot of the concerns were. And I'm not sure if the whataboutery, well, if they were in India, they would be unsafe. Well, but they're not. They've been encouraged to come to Qatar, where they're living in awful, they're living in substandard accommodation, stories of people having their passports taken away from them and being told that that's serious enough to warrant attention. But the truth is, once the football started, no one really cared.
Yeah. And also, whether it's a sport or doing any other job, I don't think it really matters. I think if the conditions within which people are working are dire, it doesn't matter if they've been brought into the sport, whether they've been brought in to do domestic work. People should be given the human dignity to be provided decent conditions within which to work. And I don't think that's what the Qatari were providing. And that's where the criticism was. But I get Katrina's point on the hypocrisy. Factories in China, for example, Amazon workers in the US, they work in the exact same conditions, and yet the West are pointing...
Do they? They're not working in great conditions, but I would
argue that they're just as oppressed. The garment workers in Bangladesh, they're just as oppressed. There was a story not too long ago of a factory going up in flames and a whole load of people dying.
And all the clothes we wear and all the objects we buy and everything are coming from China, from India, from Bangladesh. So I don't see how our hands are clean when it comes to talking about these things.
But then coming back then to the book itself, Rodney examines multi-corporations and neo-colonialism. And Taiwo, earlier on you mentioned Unilever, and how colonialism is not just about nations, it's also about companies and the people like the Glencores going to mine and the De Beers mining diamond in Africa.
In South Africa, yeah.
Yeah. So colonialism or neo-colonialism is not just about governments and countries. It's now also extended to organizations. And the question I wanted to ask, so now in Africa, we are also getting millionaires or billionaires. So for example, Dangote. And then are we now saying that all these millionaires, these African millionaires, are also now participating in the exploitation of African resources and African people? Because Dangote owns factories in multiple countries in Africa. He basically controls cement production. He's building an oil refinery in Nigeria.
So because you started from the start of your question, you're talking about the role of business now.
Yeah, and multi-corporations, multinational corporations.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that it started with business. We think of it as government, but if you look at the history of like the East India Company, that was a company that went out and it started to make lots of money, and then it had the implicit and then the explicit backing of the government. And I think this is the point that Rodney makes really well. This has always been about business.
Yes.
This is economics. Yeah. It's and that's what I felt was the strength of the book, because these are difficult conversations to have. Even today, it's easy to talk about, to get wrapped up into these sentimental arguments. Oh, colonialism was bad. It was very oppressive for people. Perhaps one way to effectively get across to people the scale and the damage that was done is to talk about it in an economic sense, with an economic framework. And perhaps it makes it easier to explain and easier to get across the scale and the devastation that was brought upon these countries. Yeah, maybe. I don't know about Dangote personally.
Taiwo, speak up for your man now.
Do we think he's acquired all of his wealth by treating everyone in a wonderful way and no one is suffering? He could well be. He could be a wonderful, a new image for the multimillionaire / billionaire. Mm-hmm. How to do it the ethical way. Does anybody make $1 billion in an ethical way? Is it possible to make $1 billion ethically, whatever ethical means?
I'm not sure. I mean, you look at the likes of Zuckerberg, whose millions are made out of exploiting our data. You look at Musk, and let's not. Let's talk about him.
When they started, everybody thought they were good. It's interesting you talk about the Zuckerbergs and Musk.
Yeah.
There still is a kind of a cult of personality. Everybody thought what they were doing was a good thing.
Yeah.
And it's only in recent years we've kind of lifted up the lid and gone, oh,
Ooh,
okay.
Is that what they've been really doing? Yeah.
This is the damage. And maybe that's the same for millionaires, multimillionaires and billionaires in Africa. Maybe can I flip it on its head and ask, why shouldn't they make lots of money exploiting? Everybody else has been allowed to do it. Why is Dangote being held to a higher standard than everyone else?
Exactly. I think, elites are elite. It doesn't make a difference whether they're African or whether they're Russian, or American. Elites are elites to me. And they are part of humanity. There are always people who are going to take that view that it's perfectly justified for them to increase their own power and their own family's power, and they are not responsible for looking after their country. I mean, we talk about it as if it was a given that leaders should be doing things for the good of their countries. But actually, some of these leaders obviously don't think that's the given. It's more important for them, first of all, to build up a smaller, their own group within, their family, their hangers-on. Mm-hmm. And presumably they sleep well at night. They don't think...
They probably do. I mean, come on, if you have a house that's, I don't know how many bedrooms...
God has blessed them, after all.
I'm sure they sleep very well at night.
Mm.
So then, final question. How does Africa wean itself off the dependency? Katrina, you got your hands on your face. It's not possible, is basically what you're saying.
No, I'm sure it's possible, but I won't be the one that has the answer. Someone much cleverer than me will come up with the answer.
Now, does Rodney actually make any suggestions? There are parts in the book where he does talk about Africa shouldn't follow the same path as the West, because what's happened in the West is not necessarily the best model for humanity as a whole.
Yeah, and he talks about them acting in their own interests.
Yeah.
So this goes back to the point, the uncomfortable truth that there are some Africans who've played a role in this exploitation. So if they're acting in their own interests, I suppose what that looks like in different countries is a really interesting discussion. I suppose in some ways it also goes back to this point about Asia. And I don't think the comparison is helpful. Well, if they did it, why couldn't they? But maybe that doesn't mean you can't look at what were some of the steps that Asia took, or Asian countries, I should say, have taken, because development across that region isn't equal. What are some of the steps that have been taken? I think this is where we come back to your benevolent
dictator.
Yeah. Is it planned? Is it planned development? Is it looking for where they have comparative advantage? We did get onto an interesting discussion towards the end about leaders like Kagame in Rwanda.
Yeah.
What he's trying to do to spearhead development in Rwanda, which coincidentally includes him remaining leader for a very long time. But also countries like Ethiopia, how they've been much more strident in their dealings with the West and countries like China in saying, yeah, but we need to get something out of this as well, and we have to be involved in this as well, and you have to cut us in. So, I don't know. I'm not even sure cleverer people can figure this out. I think part of the problem is we always defer to clever people.
But then, having said that, who are the clever people nowadays?
Exactly. The people with the letters after their name, just because, the kind of the technocrats who can give you all the theory, but none of the on-the-ground practice of how things actually work.
We don't even have activists like Walter Rodney now. I couldn't name anybody that I would say is out there advocating and pushing for Africa or any specific African nation.
Or for a different type of economic development. There must be. There must be out there.
I think
maybe
there
don't have the
environmentalists, aren't there, that are more the activists of today. And there are some in Africa, which what's the name of the lady? There's a lady in Kenya who's...
Wangai Maathai.
Probably, yes, I don't know.
Yeah, but she died, didn't she? And no one's taken over from her.
But there are other people, but I don't I can't give you their names, so I suppose you're making your point. But I think it's in that area that you get more activism nowadays.
Climate change, yeah. She's probably rolling in her grave. I don't know if you've seen videos of baobab trees that are thousands of years old being uprooted. The last I heard is that they were being taken to the US.
Oh no!
Really? Why?
Because
to be replanted, or their wood used
to be replanted in the US. Why? And then the Maasai are now being. This is where I think you think, okay, where does environmental come in, and where do humans and the way people live their life come in? Again, environmentalists, so-called environmentalists, are now coming and trying to kick the Maasai off the land that they've been living in for thousands of years.
Yeah, so that's going on. And there's so much of these issues.
Yeah. So.
And who leads them as well? I know we're talking about climate. There's a whole argument about climate justice, and I think one of the tensions is that, particularly in the climate change space, you have a lot of people perhaps coming from the global north and saying, well, you've got to move away from this type of development. And people are turning around and going, well, hold on, you've been allowed to develop. You've allowed, you look at
the environment more than we have. And now you're coming and telling us, actually, don't do this.
Yeah.
When our nations are just trying to get to where you are.
Yeah. And it's perhaps it's more expensive for us to do it the electric way and those green industries. But perhaps then you could say, well, they're an opportunity. If you could build better first time round, then there's economic benefits as well as green benefits. It all feels really complicated and sometimes, dare I say it, a bit murky. It needs African voices to speak for Africa. Sorry. Well, isn't that obvious? But it's if one thing needs to change, it's people of those countries have got to lead this charge.
Yeah, I don't think the leaders are going to do that, or people in positions of power. I think it's more, this should start like with grassroots movements, people on the ground. The normal man on the street really is the person that should be leading that, because I think the more pressure that they put on their governments, on their leaders, people in power, the more they're likely to get something done. But catch-22 is the ordinary man of the street is just trying to get a roof over his head and, get some food for his children, pay for school fees. He hasn't got time to be out on the street advocating for, all these changes. So it's kind of like we're stuck in a catch-22 situation.
But this is where Rodney comes in his own history, becomes really interesting because he was on the ground advocating for change.
Yeah.
He had an opportunity to leave, and he was told to leave because he was in danger, because he was advocating, and he was very much, I've got to be here. If I'm trying to make change, I've got to be here on the ground. And that's where he was assassinated. It's really hard.
I don't think this is one that we're going to somehow solve or even come close to coming up with any reasonable way to go forward. But I think the book really helps highlighting the dire straits that African nations are in, and also just how, I think more importantly, how we've got to where we are. I think it's really useful for that.
I think the book is very useful because I'm making all these criticisms, but I'm not really criticizing. I'm just saying that there is more research about some of these things later on. We have the same problem, I think. When he wrote that book, I wonder who read it. People like yourselves, probably. Maybe people like myself. But the vast majority of the people still go on. People's view of Africa is still very minimal, really, isn't it? They have a few different snapshots of things, a lot of them quite negative, but it just doesn't feature in so many ways. I saw a list the other day that was to do with philosophical kind of ideas of body and soul, and they listed all these different things like Indian and Chinese and Asian and what have you ideas, and probably even American Indians. Did we see anything about like those ideas we read in the, what's the book called? The Orchestra of
Minorities.
And all these, which are really interesting ideas which are not dissimilar, but they are never there. Nobody has ever heard of them. I read that I saw something. Sorry?
I was just going to interrupt and say, but isn't part of that the fact that we as Africans, we've also abandoned our culture and our way of seeing the world? And
because of education, though, isn't it? It's because of this Eurocentric, northern, Western dominated education, and this idea that
and not just Christianity, also Islam.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know if you know anything of this, Taiwo. I saw some way of, like, if you go to, I suppose, a kind of fortune teller to tell your future, and it was all about the way certain discs fell, whether they were this side or that side. But I thought it was so like the I Ching, which is all about, like, if you toss coins and you get different combinations. And it was so similar from Nigeria.
Is it the kola nut? The kola nut, the discs of kola nut.
I think so. I can't remember the details of it now. But I was really interested, and it was impossible to find anything really on Google. I looked it up, and there were very, very, very few references that would really... And I think there was a book you could buy that's probably out of print, you know. It's things like that. I find it so frustrating that it's all there, but nobody knows because it's so difficult to access these different ideas. Because don't you think all these undermine they're what drives people to think that we must do it in the way the West do it?
Yeah, but also there's also this idea that West is best or the West knows best. So those are the two ideologies, I guess. I would recommend Isaac Samuels. He sends out...
I've got to read it. Yes, yeah. I know the website now, but I haven't had time to go into it properly. But I was fascinated just sort of scrolling a bit.
If you subscribe, he sends out a weekly newsletter. Different African regions, different kingdoms, and different ages, and how those communities developed. So I would definitely recommend him.
Can I ask you quickly about Uganda? Have you come across pre-colonial Caesarean section?
Yeah.
It's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is the answer. Sorry, I haven't come across that, but I feel like this is the answer to your question. Like, it's not, why don't people know about this? Why is it not there? It is incumbent on us to read these books, to share this information. It's for us to kind of almost push a lot of this into the mainstream in a way that other stuff has been pushed into the mainstream. Mm-hmm. And it's so embedded, we don't even think that once upon a time people didn't engage with these ideas, but now they do. So, yeah, what...
Decolonizing the curriculum, is that all part and parcel of the same thing?
Yeah, I don't think it's just the curriculum, it's also the mind, as Gugu Wathiongo would say. Because there are a lot of people who, you take them through the curriculum and they'll learn things, but, you know, if their minds are always West is best, they're not going to change. So you also need to change the mindset and actually how people view themselves and view their cultures.
You've got to overcome television.
Well, that's a huge challenge.
Well, you say that, but I did notice when I was having my daily look on Netflix, you're seeing more shows now which are set in, you know, the Nigerian housewives or set in South Africa. Now, you can make a comment on whether you think that's quality entertainment, but this idea that they're starting to branch out into different, you know, they're finding stories in different places. Sometimes I think there's a lot of people talk about soft power and cultural cachet. You know, Afrobeats is now like
mainstream.
Yeah. And that's a lot of people's first entry into a new country and a new culture. Music, what they see on TV, as well as the books they read. So maybe it is out there, or maybe we have to...
The only caveat I would add to that is who's making the editorial decisions on these shows that are being commissioned.
It's true.
Yeah, if they're just imitating, because the other day, I saw someone, you know, ranting on about the Real Housewives of Kenya. I'm like, but hold on a second. There are a lot of creative people in Kenya. Why are we imitating something that starts in the US? Why do we need the Real Housewives of Kenya? Why can't we just show something different about Kenya? So I think TV is a good medium to educate people, but it depends what it is that we're showing on TV.
Yeah, but do people want to watch something different? People. I've spent so much time looking at those hearing about those housewives show and just thinking I don't understand why people want to watch those shows, but they're still going. So clearly somebody is. But yeah, maybe there is not a new age, but tastes are evolving. And yeah, you look at the role of social media and democratizing access to information and screwing up young minds. Two things can be true at the same time. There are different ways to learn and discover, and we just need to encourage more people to get out there, use their voice and to tell stories, and set up book clubs which encourage you to read books like this.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, I think I was reflecting on this for myself. I think it's really for people like us who are interested in reading. Mm-hmm. I deliberately wanted to attend a book club like this because I wanted to read, I wanted to hear about and be exposed to books that I wouldn't necessarily see when I walked into Waterstone straight away. Mm-hmm. So there's an element of it has to come to you, but also you have to kind of take responsibility and go and find it as well.
Yeah, but I think the challenge is to get people to be interested. I find that with everything else, with social media, games, TV, Netflix, there's so much that's taking people's attention. And so when you put a book in front of someone who doesn't naturally read anyway, it's a challenge. It's a real big challenge to try and get people to actually read, and, especially books like this that are challenging and difficult to read.
But also there's that issue, isn't there, of the fact that the publishing industry in the West is very well developed, whereas in the global South, not necessarily the same. So,
and books are not as accessible.
Not everyone can afford a book. And so there's a thriving second-hand book market. But the thirst for knowledge and the thirst for the written page is great in countries like Nigeria, where you can't always have access to a library and you can't always buy all the books you want.
But are there people taking steps to address that?
Yeah, they're
not necessarily rely on government, because that perspective is interesting for me to hear, because everything I've been reading recently is that Nigeria is a literary powerhouse.
It is. Compared to the rest of Africa, Nigeria is. And Nigeria actually has a lot of publishing houses that are publishing local content. So Nigeria and Kenya and South Africa are the three countries that, literature and publishing greater than other parts of Africa. But the problem is, can people afford to buy a book? That's the issue. And also, are books as valued? Sorry, what? Yes.
Because it says here, first published in Nigeria by Masobe Books, 2021. First published in Great Britain by Swift Press, 2022.
So there's a lot of publishing houses in Nigeria, and I think they're doing well. They're leading the charge for literature, Nigeria and Kenya. So I have hope, because I don't think every month I hear of a new publishing company or I hear of a new journal that's been set up to encourage African writing. I think for me, my challenge is just getting the young people to be interested in books. I don't feel enough young people. Let me speak for Uganda. I don't feel enough young people in Uganda are as interested in books as they are in Netflix and TV and football.
And that is a challenge that's across the board. Mm. That's not a Ugandan problem. That's not an African problem. That's worldwide. Mm. The competition for the young people's attention.
Yeah.
You see, there's a story about an influencer who was causing chaos in New York by handing out free games consoles. So that's where attention is being diverted. But we can't give up yet.
Well, I'm not giving up. We're not giving up. We're here,
Despite the fact that there are many more YA novels now than there ever were, aren't there?
Yeah. Mm. And children's books as well.
Yeah. We were talking about Queenie recently. I know it might not be a favourite book of everyone on this call, but actually it did have a wide readership. So the
fact that it got published at all said something.
When you say readership, do you mean that it wasn't just Black people who were reading it, or younger people were reading it?
Yeah, to get the numbers it did. Mm-hmm. I think it was a good thing for her and more widely, Black literature. It might not be the story I personally wanted to read, but for a lot of people, that might have been the first book by a Black woman they were reading. It was a story that perhaps resonated with, younger black girls, black girls who are reading for the first time, or young black boys, it's not just gender specific. They're not going to pick up a Walter Rodney, but they'll read Queenie. It's it might have been, popular fiction in the vein of, Jojo Moyes or some of those other stories, but it's a book and young people are reading. So
he encourages them.
Whichever way they come.
Yeah, I mean, anything that encourages young people to read, I'm up for.
I think this is I hear everything that Katrina is saying about the dating in the history and the way it feels. I understand what you're saying, but I feel it was of its time in the way it was written, but it still has so much relevance today in some of the arguments he was making.
I totally agree with that.
I'm glad I read it. And just to go back to what was said at the beginning, it was definitely on the book on my shelf that I'm going to read that one day. 5 years later, I haven't got past page 1. But I think for everybody who's interested in these issues, who's interested in development, who's interested in economic development, social development, I think it's a good place to start. Or further reading required,
and it's foundational, isn't it?
And I still stand by it, saying that even for someone who wants to read about pre-colonial African history, it's a great place to start, because it does have a lot about how the communities were prior to contact with the Europeans.
And also, strictly speaking, it's not a history book, is it? I guess it's more towards economics than history, but because it touches upon pre-colonial history, it's very helpful. It's like an easy way in, which is useful.
Yes, I'd agree with all that, because it's not a history book. And I think, Kay, what you said, that it setting the fact that there was pre-colonial history for people who perhaps were a bit oblivious to that. If I take it in that context, then yes, it's a good place to start.
Well, I think, 1 hour, 50 minutes. Yeah, we've been talking a lot. So I just really want to say thank you so much. It's been a very interesting conversation. I think we've meandered into all sorts of areas away from the book. But I think the book is a great place to start a lot of discussions on different things. And so it just leaves me to ask, out of 5, how would you rate it? And then would you recommend it?
I give it a 3.5. I would recommend it, but I'd recommend things like what's the book
Black and British?
No. I would recommend that, but it's Kahindi. What's his book called?
New Age of Empire.
Yes, I would recommend that more. I think just because the writing's more modern and the referencing system is more modern.
It's more up to date, yeah.
Yes, up to date. But I wouldn't not recommend. I would also recommend Rodney Walter and give it 3.5 at least.
Yeah, very strong 4.5 is what I'm going to go with. And yeah, absolutely, I would recommend this book. It's, again, somebody said, one of the foundational texts. I think it's well worth a read.
I agree with you, and I too would give it a 4.5. I think that, basically following what Katrina just said, I think maybe you should start with this book before reading Kahinde Andrews' book, because I think this will give you the background and then some of the context. But I think Kahinde Andrews' New Age of Empire will then really open it up to the world today and how the world functions today. So that's what order. If I was to recommend both of them, that's the order I would recommend that you read them. But yeah, I still think that this is a really useful book because it just helps you to understand how the system is today and why Africa is underdeveloped. Thank you guys for your time. Thank you for joining and have a wonderful rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. And thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this or any of our other episodes, please subscribe, like and share on Spotify, YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Till next time, bye-bye.